Good morning all. Welcome to the March meeting, public meeting of our Trust Board. As you suggested last time, we've increased the timing of the meeting by another 30 minutes to run until 1 o'clock. Hopefully we won't need all that time. That just gives us a little bit of time just to make sure we cover off the main items on the agenda. The meeting will be recorded by Teams and that will be made available afterwards. And the meeting is open to the public, so I give them a warm welcome and remind them, please, if you don't mind keeping your cameras off and you stay on mute, you should be able to follow the proceedings and we'll preserve the internet strength as well. Can I also give a warm welcome to Subo Shangmulanathan, who's joined us as a new non-executive director. So welcome, Subo, and I'll refer to you, and also to Joe Garcia. This is Joe's last meeting before a retirement, and I shall refer to both our arrival and our departure in my chairman's report shortly. So a warm welcome to you, Subo, and pleased to acknowledge your arrival. I've got apologies from Fiona Moore and Howard Goodborn. Are there any other apologies I need to know, Peter?
No, just those two. And we've got Richard Quirk here for Fiona.
Yep. Richard's here for Fiona, so welcome, Richard. And we'll be aiming for a comfort break as around 11:30, depending how the business progresses. So let's moving on straight into the agenda. First of all, the minutes of the last meeting, are they a true and accurate record of our last meeting?
Chairman, I've received a note. There was a couple of minor typos which I'll correct, but subject to that, I think
they don't alter the sense of the minute. That's fine. So I'll take those as a true and accurate record. Thank you. Peter, the action log, please.
Yeah. So as stated, there's one open action that arose from the discussion we had at the last meeting in January, which Chairman will pick up as part of the consideration for the next April board development session.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues content with the action log? Thank you. Right, we'll now move on to the board story, which Philip, I think you're going to introduce.
Thank you, David. I was privileged and in some ways saddened by an event that took place this week, which was the National Day of Remembrance. So it was done in conjunction with a whole bunch of other NHS trusts, but also, as you will have seen, the National Day of Remembrance was picked up increasingly nationally. So a reflection on the 23rd, and for us, it was a reflection on quite a sad year for losses. So not all COVID related by any means, but normally in a year we would expect to lose 6-7 colleagues on average, but this year from the end of March last year to the end of March this year, that figure was 14. So this, I just wanted to use the public board to express our deep regret and sadness, but also our pride in the fact that whilst there were things going on that none of us wanted to happen, the rest of the organisation proved resilient and carried on doing a fantastic job for our patients. So the board story is really just a farewell, and just as a word of warning, there is one of our team members on the video you're going to see. So let's just flick through to the video. So two stories I want to pick up from that list. I'm not going to talk about individuals as to talk about one individual might seem to not be talking about others. But there are a couple of things that came out of some of the work that those individuals did that I think we should note. Firstly, Caroline Flack was one of the first people I met when I joined the organisation. And the reason that I was meeting her was that she was seriously ill. And she was part of the inspiration for us as a trust signing up to the Dying to Work Charter. This is a charter whereby we say to people who, if they are so seriously ill that we would normally retire them on ill health grounds, but they want to continue working in some way, that we will do that. And we did that with Caroline, and she was able to work in some capacity, really quite close to her final day. And the communication we've had from the family, including her sister who works for us, has been that made her final year so much better than it might otherwise have been. So I think we as a board agreed to do that. So I think we should recognise that that's a good thing, and it costs us a bit, but it gives us back so much more. So I would commend that to us. And secondly, we have been talking to Tricia's family about how we will remember her influence on the trust, and it will be something to do with training and research, but we haven't agreed the final detail yet. That's all I was going to say, David. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Philip. We honour their memory and all that they did for patients and for our colleagues, so thank you for that. If I could just move on just to introduce the chair's reports, and I just remind us that why we're here. The enduring purpose of CCAM is to respond to the immediate needs of our patients and to improve the health of the communities we serve. And our strategy in everything we do is aimed at helping to achieve this purpose. And the focus of the meeting today really is just to emphasise the work that's been done within the organisation since we last met in January as a formal board. Although between the public board meetings, we have met several times in committee as well as informally as the board to keep the work of the trust progressing. And our work is summarised in the integrated performance report referred to IPR. You'll see in the papers, and we'll be going through that in some detail later on in the meeting. And whilst it's only correct that we focus over the last couple of weeks and months has been very much on our response to the COVID pandemic, I think you'll see in the papers that our attention is now starting to turn to some of the underlying issues which we are challenged with, and some of which are highlighted in the performance report. And we're going to use the performance report to assess the areas that still require improvement and the corrective actions being taken, and make sure that is being triangulated with the work of our board committees. We're closing down one financial year or governance year and commencing another, so it's just appropriate we recognise what's happened in the last year. And I think it's been an unprecedented year, but nevertheless we start afresh in April, and we hopefully see the light at the end of the tunnel in relation to the COVID pandemic. On a positive note, I mentioned the last meeting that the Council of Governors were in the final stages of appointing a new independent non-executive director. So I'm very pleased indeed to formally welcome Subo to her first meeting, and I hope this is the start of a long and happy period working with CCAM. We look forward to your contributions to this meeting and all other subsequent meetings, Subo. So it's good to have you with us. Welcome. Well, I'm also pleased to say that we'll also have 2 new colleagues joining the board team in the near future from the 1st of April as part of the next director scheme. And this is a scheme that's led by NHS England to support senior people from groups who are currently underrepresented on trust boards to make sure they can acquire the skills and expertise necessary to take the final step to becoming a director of an NHS board. And I'm really pleased that Christopher Gonde and Mamta Gupta will be joining us, and I look forward to working with them over the next 12 months and to get their insight into the work into our committee work and to the board. And whilst we welcome new colleagues, with some sadness, but also I know that some joy to Joe in particular, as Joe Garcia, he's coming to the point where he's retiring with considerable honour from a long and distinguished career in public service, particularly the ambulance service, but before that with the armed forces, and a great record of service to the public, and has been a valued colleague both to board members, but really regarded well throughout the organisation, particularly for those of our team who work on our clinical front line, where Joe has been a great supporter, and after joining CCAM as a challenging time in our history, has worked very hard indeed to improve our offering to patients and our standing with the public. So Joe, you've earned a long and happy retirement, and we give you our best wishes. We're just the work of the organisation continues though, so we're in the process of recruiting Joe's replacement, and I'm also pleased to announce that Emma Williams will be the interim executive director of operations from the 1st of April. So Emma, all the very best with your interim work, and we look forward to your contribution as well to the board in that time. So I think I've also referred to some of the duties of chair in the report for your information. And the final item is, as we return to what everyone describes as the new normal, I'm very nervous about setting targets in this area, or speaking of firm dates, because in spite of the success of the vaccination programme, it's clearly the challenges with the COVID pandemic remain. Nevertheless, I'm working with the executive to encourage how we're going to work in this new virtual world, where hopefully we can meet each other in person in the not too distant future, and transact business in the normal way, but find a appropriate way of working within the restrictions which will still remain for some time, in order to ensure that we are all safe as members of the public, and we can do the best for our patients. So that's the introduction from my report. So let's press on now into the main item, and so we're going to take the board assurance framework, which Peter will lead. Peter.
Thank you, Chairman. So just to remind the board that in the last meeting in public in January, quite rightly actually, it was timely that the challenge on the board was to take a fuller review of the BAF risks to ensure that they were sort of more longer term in view, acknowledging that the risks up until now have been relatively sort of consistent. So we did that. And this is the outcome of the review that the Exec Management Board has undertaken. It's been considered by the Audit Committee, as reflected in the Audit Committee report later on the agenda, with some support. And so, subject to the board's view this morning, we'll work it out now into the usual report format, where we set out all the controls and actions, etc. In the paper before the board today, there's a table that outlines what the proposed risks are and how they'll replace the risks that have been in place up until now. And just want to pick up a couple of these just for highlight, although it's set out in the report. So the board used some of its development session last month in February to review elements of the so-called operating model risk, and regular updates on that will come to the board from April, and probably be a regular standing agenda item until that work's concluded. So there'll be good visibility on that specific risk. Later today in the agenda, there'll be an update on the workforce risk. This is in part 2 due to a mix of timing and some commercial sensitivities, but it will come through in the usual way for the next public board meeting in April. And then the other risks are reflected in the board committee escalation reports, as I've listed in this paper, just to reflect the sort of view that's been taken in relation to those. Chairman, that's all I was going to say just by way of introduction.
Thank you, Peter. Colleagues, do you have any wish to clarify any points on the board assurance framework that's before you? Have we captured the risks appropriately? And you're all content? I'll take silence and some nods as approval. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item, which is the Chief Executive report. Philip.
Thank you, David. And I'd like to start rather like you did, David, by welcoming Subo to the trust. We haven't even had our first get together, Subo, but we exchanged a couple of emails. But I'm looking forward to working with you over the coming years, and I look forward to the difference that you will make to the way in which we think and operate as a board. So welcome. And then, very, very sad in a way, great in another way. I'd like to echo the chairman's words about Joe and to wish him well. He's supposed to be leaving on a boat next Wednesday, but unfortunately the government have got other ideas, so that his sailing will have to wait a tiny bit. But I think it'll happen. Joe makes things happen, as he's done for us for many years, and I look forward to getting emails from various parts of the Mediterranean and other places that over the coming years, as we watch him sail around with his family. So farewell to Joe, and welcome to the board to Emma in her interim role, whilst we do the recruiting. So let's move on to. I just want to say something about the strategic position we find ourselves in. This is something that we always do at the board, because, of course, by the gap between when I write the paper and present this item, things have been moving at such pace during the pandemic that the world has changed between those two things happening, and it hasn't been quite so dynamic this time. So there isn't a massive things aren't moving at massive pace, but there are a couple of issues that I'd like to look at. So our cases, particularly in the southeast, but across the country, are still going down really, really well. In terms of the effect that has on us, and the effect that the effect it's having on the hospitals, everything is looking as though it's going in the right direction, and therefore the government roadmap that we've issued with the set dates still look, from the internal perspective, to be on track. So we would expect things to start. The next date of note is the 29th, and then it goes on until mid-June. So none of those dates are confirmed until they're confirmed, but everything internally is looking good for that to continue. So David's mentioned his desire to start getting the board back together and that sort of thing. Those sorts of things will be possible if it goes ahead. But and there is a big but. There are a number of variants that we are concerned about. The one that is highest in the press, of course, is the South African variant, and we've got a reasonable grip in this country over the South African variant. So we're identifying it quite well and isolating it and testing around it, and that appears to be working to this stage. The problem is that, and this isn't a political point by any means, the same is not the case in France, where the South African variant is increasing exponentially, and as we speak, the borders between us and France are open, and people are coming through without being checked. So that's a significant risk for us, but as are other new variants. So there are new variants being discovered all the time. So we have to be keeping ourselves. So the way in which we are doing this in the executive is we are talking about trying to get things feeling a bit more normal, but we need to keep the trust ready to be nimble, because it just takes one of these variants to defeat the vaccination, and we're back to where we were this time last year. It is that simple. So we're watching for that. We do think there'll be a third wave, whether or not we get the variants change, but it will have less impact. That's what we're planning for at the moment. A third wave that is less impactful, and the reason it's less impactful is because of the vaccination program, which means that people don't get as ill. People will still get it in a third wave, but they won't get as ill. Therefore, the effect on hospitals will be less, and the effect on our staff will be less, because there's a greater chance of carrying on working whilst you have. So that is the sort of stance that we're taking. So we're beginning to look at things like our REAP levels. And you'll see in the report that we moved to REAP level 3, and since then we have, in fact, yesterday we have taken the decision to move on to REAP level 2. So we are stepping down some of the extraordinary measures that we've been taking, in line with what I was saying about the internal picture from England, and I think that's sensible. But we need to make us we're keeping ourselves ready to reverse that decision as soon as the signs of a further wave from Europe comes. So I think that's probably all I'm going to say about COVID at this stage. Current ops. So we had in the board reports that you've got a mixture of February and March data. If you go back to December and January, it was incredibly challenging, and that's why that's still reflected in the quarter to date figures. The performance was so poor and so challenged in January, not because we were doing the wrong things, but if you remember, that was when we had 500 or so staff off sick with COVID, and you can't do national standards when you've got that levels of absenteeism. So it was really challenging in January. The hospitals were causing our performance to stagnate because of the huge queues. So all of that has normalised. So in February we hit all of the targets apart from Cat1T. Cat1 mean, which we should be at 7 minutes, and we were at 7.5. And the other target that we missed was Cat3. Now, historically, as a trust, we don't hit Cat3 and Cat4. We did hit Cat4, and we only missed Cat3 by a minute and a bit. So that I would typify as a good performance. We've got work to do on Cat1 because that's where we're an outline, and Emma and Joe are working on that. In terms of March slightly more challenged for two reasons. Firstly, we've got more variable levels of staff absence again. But secondly, the demand has not been as flat as it was in February. In other words, people are doing more and therefore needing our services more. It isn't that there is, it's the sign of a next wave. This is just people doing less, looking less like they're in lockdown and more like they're in normal life. That will continue to be a factor, and we're expecting something of a reaction as things lock down less. So we're planning on extraordinary levels of activity in June when the exam comes. So we think it will be unusually busy then, and we're preparing for that. In terms of the 111 system, we've been veering and hauling a bit with our call answer performance. At some stages we've been doing really well, and others it gets more challenging, and that's a real factor of demand, where it's the very small things that the government are doing are having quite significant impact on the demand. So the schools going back has changed the demand profile absolutely, and it's understandable, and it'll settle a bit and then come back. So it is variable in that. The clinic, the team, Joe's team in the 111 have done really well with the clinical bits. So the clinical activity, the clinical assessments have been continued with really strong performance. Although we have been focusing a bit on trying to get the ambulance conveyance rate, the ambulance transfer rate down from it got up to about 15%. We're trying to get that down. And the new services, things like 111 First, are still embedding. With David's doing some negotiations about how much of that we expect to do for the coming year. But the services are working and working well. And the biggest thing which is reflected in my report is that EPS was so electronic prescribing was going to go live, and at the time of writing it wasn't live. I'm pleased to report that it is now live, and so that's a real first for us. And it sounds like quite a small thing, but actually it's really significant. Because it's a new skill, it's a difficult skill, and it's one that is fraught with new areas that we need to make sure that we're doing safely and that sort of stuff. So Richard and his team have been heavily involved in making sure that we're doing that safely, and slowly. So I say it's in. We're still doing a mix of our partial solution and our full solution at the moment, but over the coming weeks we'll move completely onto the Cleric system, and that will mean that probably within a month or so we'll be running the service as it was designed to run. So that's good news. A couple of other bits I just want to point to: staff awards. So we are going to do some virtual staff awards. We gave everyone the choice of waiting until we could do them in person, or having some virtual awards. About 50 of our staff have said they'd rather have some virtual awards, so we're doing that. We're doing that next month, and I'm hoping that the majority of you will be there to help us celebrate that. It's obviously not going to feel and be like doing it in process, but we've done some good bits. So everyone who's getting an award will also get a hamper so that they can be sitting there with some nice things to have surrounding them, and some other nice bits and pieces, as well as their medal, which will be presented. And we'll have on our side of the screen, hopefully, so the Queen's representatives to help to add the passing out of those medals. So I'm glad that we're doing that for those who want it. I'm also happy to give those who want to do it in person the chance to do it in person once it is safe to do so. The staff survey, pretty similar to last year's staff survey. So there's about 14 bits of it that look like they've got better, and some bits that have got slightly worse. There's nothing significant in any of those movements. And so I typify that by saying, given that this was a really difficult year, we had, as we've just said, really difficult things going on in the trust, and a level of dislocation and separation between physical management and everything else. I was really quite pleased that some of the bits had stood up really well. I was worried that some of the communications bits might go, but our communication with senior managers' scores were positive. I'd say positive, relatively positive, and better than they were before. So that was as a result of the increased use of the electronic medium and everything. So I'm pleased with that. But we're thinking carefully about this staff survey, and we're going to do that thinking as a continuum, as opposed to as a rush. Let's get some plans. The individual groupings, the OUMs and the various departments are all doing their own, but over how we do it as a trust is something that we need. It takes a deal of care, and that's something I did learn from my previous organisation, which did this really slowly. And I'm watching their results. They're now top of the tree on the staff survey in the ambulance service. And it was a question of being really considered about your reactions and getting the communications right. So that's the approach that we're taking to it. We had a really good hour or so on this yesterday as an exec team, and there's lots of things that you could rush at and just get wrong. So we will be doing our reaction in a much more considered way and a long-term view, as opposed to trying to improve the staff survey for next year. It's about making people feel better in the organisation rather than a narrow focus on the odd question or two in the staff survey. And lastly, I was delighted to be involved in the launch of our gender network. Emma is chairing that for us. So thank you for. I think it's interim chair, isn't it, Emma? So I think it's an important thing, and the reason I think it's important is that if you look at our mix as we're looking at when we get onto the gender pay gap. You can see that in the small pockets, such as band 9, we can and have made got things close to parity, and at the bottom level we've got more women in the service than we have men, but the middle managers, particularly in the 999 service, are still predominantly men. I've got a screenshot the other day of 44 OMs. And there was one woman, and that's not good enough. So I'm delighted that we will be focusing on that through not only through that gender, but by the way in which we recruit and the way in which we do everything. So delighted to see that. The escalation that I've given you is ops, and we'll talk about that when we get on to the next item. David, that's it.
Thank you, Philip. Colleagues, any points of clarification or you in Philip's report before we move on to the performance report? It was a wide-ranging report. Terry Parkin, good morning.
Thank you, David. Hello. Thanks, Philip. This is a great report. These are getting better and better each month, both in terms of how they look and actually the content that it presents such a positive view of the organisation. It came up, we discussed this at the last meeting and we discussed at the governors, this is the issue of the crew welfare vehicles, and linked across to the staff survey, where we've got, I think you've said broadly no change from last year, but that also understates the fact there was some significant improvements last year. So we have made some significant improvements in how the staff feel about the organisation. I'm just a little nervous. I know how this is funded, and I don't want to upset David too much. I know how this is funded, and I know that funding has come from outside of the organisation. But I'm just a little wary of the fact that just because there are some relaxations nationally of what people can and cannot do at the end of the month, it doesn't mean necessarily our crews will still have access to hospital canteens and some of the other places where they might normally have looked to take a break. I'm just wondering, your report says that, we've looked at the learning. I'm just wondering what we're doing from the 1st of April to support staff who still are having extended handover delays, who still cannot find somewhere where they can safely get a drink or take a break. As I said, it feels to me that I understand why we're doing this now. I understand why we have to do it. I wonder if, though, bearing in mind that we've still got considerable COVID pressures on our staff, and if you look on the staff channels, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, I'm not sure they all knew that this was ending at the end of the month. I'm just wondering how you can reassure the board that we're continuing to have staff welfare front and centre in what we do going forward from the 1st of April.
Yeah, I'll say a little. I'll hand over to Joe when I've had a say. So the staff welfare vehicles are something that was an extremist, a reaction to extremist pressure. They are not a cure-all. They don't. Because there aren't many of them, and they can only be in one place at one time, and the vast majority of our staff are not there. They're off dealing with patients. So did absolutely the right thing to do when it was very difficult, but not the most efficient way of providing welfare. So we've got to get welfare in our normal systems, and so the staff welfare will keep that on the back burner, so we can go back to it if we want to. But actually, we've got to concentrate on providing a permanent solution to staff welfare, as opposed to what this is, which was a reaction to really bad things, and you can hit the really horrible spots for a short time. But actually, we need 24/7 answers at every place where it's needed. So that's what we've got to concentrate on. Joe, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, Philip. Yes, and on that vein, the key thing for staff welfare is to ensure that they have a meal break. Having regular breaks in what we're doing has to be the key to focusing on our staff welfare out there. As Philip has identified, the welfare vehicles were a useful addition where we just couldn't get people back from hospitals, where we couldn't give people the regular breaks, where we couldn't give them a secondary break alongside their main meal break. And that has to be our key focus when we consider our staff welfare, is to ensure that they get the breaks that they deserve. And that has become a key focus of the daily safety huddles that are had each morning with operations team. We call them teams, a Teams e-call, but effectively it's a safety huddle. That's a common language in the NHS, where we look at the ongoing pressures and what our concerns are for the next period, and they happen 7 days a week. And part of that safety huddle is a reporting on a number of meal breaks and rest breaks issued, so that we're driving that to be as high as possible. So to give you an example, for the period of effectively March to date, we have only had 0.76% of shifts where we have not been able to give a break within the shift time. 92.19% of those breaks were issued on the operational desks that the crew work from, so they're not working out of area. And colleagues who will remember the amount of rest breaks we used to issue, which is a secondary break effectively, which is technically a paid break. It was probably barely touched 1% in the early days. For the month to date, we're at 26.21% of those rest breaks. So the focus for welfare, Terry, has to be giving people a just step out of the system rather than an extra cup of tea or a cup of tea or a snack whilst they're literally in the process of cleaning their vehicle down for the next job.
Thank you.
Terry, can I just come back on, I didn't react to your praise about the report, and I thought that was mean, particularly as it was written while I was on leave. Yes, I started it with Janine, that Janine and David should take the credit, but I say that lightheartedly, but it is a reflection that we as a team, one, are taking leave, which is important as an example, but secondly, that we're able to cover for each other in a way that was perhaps difficult in older days, and that's something that's really important to each other.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to come in on this subject?
I've got a very quick other question, David, if that's okay at the moment.
David, so may I just come back on that then
Yep.
before you move on? So just to say thank you, I agree entirely that we need to resolve the issue through structural and strategic changes. But the most important figure I heard was the number of staff who are now getting meal breaks.
Yeah.
And for me, that indicates quite clearly that however important this is, and I think there's a sort of psychological issue about the van as much as an actual issue. It is quite clear that if we are guaranteeing far more staff having meal breaks now than we have for right the way through the crisis, I think I can absolutely see the argument for ending the welfare van. So thank you. Those statistics are really important.
Thank you, David. Michael, was your question related to this item,
No.
welfare?
No.
Well, can I just draw a line on that item just to summarise? I think it's really important and grateful that you raise it, Terry, and I'm also grateful for the detailed explanation from you, Philip. I think the message, particularly we have governors listening, and particularly our staff governors, I think the message is that the board have demonstrated we are concerned about staff welfare, and we're also assured by the response you've given in relation to ensuring they get an appropriate meal break. And I know that's a focus and work that David Hammond will be leading as well with the operational teams to ensure that that our staff get time to decompress, have their breaks in order to give better service to patients when they're actually out on the road. But I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the work of our volunteers in putting those welfare vans on the road. I mentioned our report, I had the chance to be present at a number of the hospitals with them, and I have to say we are blessed with the volunteers we have. And in those particularly difficult times when we had long queues at A&E departments, particularly in the northern part of Kent, it was a particular morale boost to our staff. So I think we acknowledge that, but I think the message to our staff is the board are concerned about your welfare, and we're going to ensure that working with the executive, we do all we can to make sure you have your statutory breaks and to be protected in your work. So it's an important message that comes from the board, and ask the executives please to note that. Michael, let's move on to your question.
Very quick question, Philip. Again, thank you for the report, whoever wrote it. My question really relates to the capital investment in Medway and Banstead. Really important to the future of CCAM and the services that we provide. There is a lot of volatility in public finances at the moment, given the implications of COVID. I think it's just the assurance that you and David Hammond can give that those projects are fully funded, we've got the capital money to deliver those, and that they will happen as intended.
Thank you. I think I can give you that assurance, and I will hand over to David in a second. Not only can I think will David give you that assurance, but also I'm sure he'll be glad to point out that a lot of the money that, particularly for the Kent project, was centrally funded, and David did great work a year and a half ago securing Wave 4 funding for that, which all appears to be coming through as we expected, and therefore the trust is going to be significantly better off than we thought we were going to be in terms of that, because we thought we were going to have to invest more of our own money into it than we are currently doing, which is why we can do it well. Okay.
Just very quickly to add to that, everything that Philip said, I would have said myself. And Michael, we've already have the signed documentation. We've had some of the allocations, and they're on a call-off order. As you do the work, you send your you send your invoice in and they pay you the cash. So some of that's already started. We've got a proven track record with delivery of that with the Brighton MRC, which was funded again under Wave 4 capital monies. So I have no concerns over that, and that's a signed and sealed deal now. So
thank you.
And we'll also be writing to the Secretary of State just to acknowledge his personal contribution towards his support to the Medway capital developments, and I look forward to sending that note to him shortly. Okay, so can we accept the Chief Executive's report with appropriate comments made by colleagues? Thank you indeed. Philip, do you want to introduce the next item, please, the Integrated Performance Report?
Yes, well, my introduction to this will be relatively brief, and I'll be handing on to Joe to start on the operations piece. But in my overview, I give you my thoughts on this. I say it every time that we have a board, because this has been something that the IPR has been something that we've been working on since I arrived. In fact, it probably started just before I arrived. And it remains something that we evolve, and I hope it never stops evolving. So I'm hoping that we never get to the point where the IPR looks exactly the same, for a bunch of episodes running, because it is the document that the senior management grouping use to make sure that the business is running on rails, and that's where we hide the data. That's where we display the data, the reports, and so it's got to be a living document, and it is. And I have in the report highlighted operational performance as an exception, and Joe will talk about that. The caring data sets, and then some complaints and patient experience that Beckham will cover. So with that said, I commend the report to you all, but I'll hand over to Joe to start with the operational elements.
Thank you. And Joe, before you come in, can I just give us an acronym warning, please? Just with respect to colleagues who've joined the board, but also our public. Be careful on the use of acronyms and make sure that they're translated to plain English, please. So I noted one slip earlier on with REAP. We didn't clarify that, but if you could make sure that's clarified in the use of language in the report. So Joe, your sign off, please.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Chair. REAP it stands for Resource Escalation Action Plan. For those that weren't familiar with that. So the performance in this month's report, I'm going to guide you through, accepting you've got the documents in front of you. We're going to start with page or slide 6 on the document, which really gives you an overview of February to date. And as you will see there, the indication arrows as to the progress of performance for February is very much looking that most of the metrics are heading in a positive direction. You'll still see some red numbers in there, which indicate the fact that the national performance was not achieved. As you heard Philip say, 1 minute and 52 seconds for our category 3 90th centile for February. But the point I will make is category 1 at 7 minutes and 33 seconds is not achieving the national targets, and if we are to look at our peers across the country, we are at the bottom end of that peer performance on category 1 mean performance, and that is a concern and something that the operations team are pretty much focused on to understand what is it about our processes, because it's predominantly a process issue that is letting us down, and they are each operating unit is focused on driving down that performance figure to get it to within the 7 minutes category. But that performance gives you a snapshot for February compared with the previous months. Slide 7 of the report will give you, if you like, a month to date and a quarter to date performance, and this was captured as of the 15th of March. And as you can see, from a month-to-date perspective, similar position to February at that particular point, but it would be fair to say that from the 15th onwards, we have seen a rise in activity that sort of mirroring now what we saw in November leading into December last year. And we just need to be conscious of the additional pressure that that's bringing. Page 8 of the report gives you effectively a balanced scorecard view. So it looks at the last 3 weeks and it gives you the performance figures for those last 3 weeks. And quite importantly, it gives you a little spark chart on the right hand side, which gives you a trend of the last 13 weeks, so that it helps to make those numbers fit into context of where they are compared to where we have been. And as you'll see there, because that 13-week period is in there, the high spikes in challenges that we had as we went through the latter part of December and into January. Page 9 of your report gives you an impression of the surge levels that we've experienced within the trust. And as you can see towards the right-hand side of that, so the surge levels are the areas where we're having most patients waiting. Now, the colour code is fairly simplistic. If you imagine traffic lights, green is a very low number of patients waiting, and red is a higher number. It is a dynamic process, so it's calculated by actually the number of patients and the amount of time they have been waiting after they have triggered a surge escalation warning trigger. So it's important that we factor that. It's not necessarily the same number of patients each time, so you can have quite a high green spike. What it means is we're processing those cases quickly because we've got resource to do that. So it was important that we understand how that works. But what I'm going to do is draw you down to page 23 of the report. And this is where I want you to look at the third line down, which is number of 999 frontline hours provided, which demonstrates why February was as good as it was. We had significant challenges with resourcing going through December and January, and we were doing everything in our power, as you can see from January's performance there. We're doing everything in our power to maximise hours. As we went into February, we started to see, we had, if you'll remember, we had the military supporting us through the latter part of January and into February, and we started to see a return to work of a lot of colleagues that had been off and out of the system because of COVID-related absence. And that additional resourcing, 103%, and I seem to remember one of the boards where I was ecstatic at the fact, I think it was May last year, where we delivered 99.1% of hours. To get to 103% of hours is a clear sign that we've been able to get back on top of that, which has delivered good performance, but it has come at a huge expense in not the cost of overtime, but the volume of overtime that we're experiencing. So we have, through February, we were probably producing near 14% of our hours through overtime alone. Now, what you might class as normal in a pre-COVID era was probably only around 5 to 6% of hours. So the fact that colleagues are willing to come in to give us that overtime has been fantastic. But the fact is, it's supporting our operational delivery at something that could collapse at any moment. Collapse in the sense of people won't work as much overtime because there's other things to do. The other element through February is that the overtime, that certainly the nighttime overtime, was incentivised with an additional payment to encourage colleagues to work some of those less favourable shifts through the night, because the way the overtime structure for the majority of ambulance staff for Agenda for Change is concerned, there is no benefit to working overtime at night as it is during the middle of the day. So that's what helped contribute to that excellent hours output, which delivers patient care. So there's a direct correlation. Put the hours in, you get the patient performance as a result. And finally, Chair, if I may, I'll draw you to page 28 or slide 28, which gives you the monthly performance snapshot in all the metrics, and you'll see there how February's performance is comparable with May 20, when it was the last time we actually delivered all metrics across May. As you can see, our category 1 performance has come back to, well, between June and July was the last time it was at that particular point. So there is work to be done. It is vital that we maintain the hours provision that we need to deliver a service to our patients. And that becomes one of the key focuses of the operations team, especially as we go into a period where we've got second vaccinations are being issued. We have an anticipated impact of those second vaccinations in short-term absence because of some of the symptoms experienced as a result of those vaccinations. Be certain they are symptoms, they are not side effects. We need to be clear on that. I will pause there, Chair, and take any questions.
Thank you, Joe. I think it's probably error rather than modesty. Your camera's turned off, so if we could.
Hopefully it's not off as far as I can see, Chair. I will flip it on and off. We've
just got a still photograph, Joe, at the moment.
Sorry about that.
It's your last meeting. We want to take every possible moment we can to see you.
Yeah, so, I think other members can see me, Chair. It's an oddity we noticed yesterday in that some people can't see all the video, which is a bit odd.
Right.
Okay.
Chair, if you flick onto large gallery and then back again, you'll see that Joe reappears.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. He's not far away from me as he's speaking, so it's good. Right, questions, Board, please. You've heard about our performance. Is there anything you wish to clarify? That's all. Laurie, did I see your hand raised?
You're on mute, Laurie.
David, I can see Michael's got his hand up, if that helps.
Yeah.
I've got mine as well. It's Lucy.
Sorry, I thought someone had muted me. Okay, I was paying you and the crew a terrific compliment, Joe, in terms of getting the performance to this level. As you say, your ability to draw hours down through overtime and other means in order to get the performance where it is really phenomenal. I wonder if you've got a comment, though, on the impact of that on, let's call it the softer side of employment, and that is on things like education, training, appraisals, because I know you call it abstraction. You've been dampening all of that activity down in order to deliver the performance you've shown us. I'm just wondering whether in the future it's going to ease up so that we can actually do what is a crucial part of our work with staff, and that is training, development, education. Is it going to get easier, or are we going to stay as strapped as we are?
Thank you for the question, Laurie. That depends on what we do about addressing that particular challenge. So the abstraction levels that we are funded for, 28.5%, are no longer enough. They've no longer been enough for a while to support all of the other factors that we want to undertake, in particular education and training of that, in particular the development training of our front or junior and middle managers is key to CCAM's success going forwards. So we need to be able to find a way of funding that. We need a plan B, because the stock option, unfortunately, and which has been through the peak of COVID, when we have been at high levels of resource escalation actions within that plan, is to stop training, to stop any education. Now, there are some things you can't stop. You can't stop students going to university because you completely break your paramedic throughput cycle going forward. So some of the things we've had to allow, but it becomes the easy option because you need to push the hours back into patient-facing hours. We have tried really hard to find all of the response-capable managers within the trust that are able to provide hours. And as a result of that, to be fair to those teams, we're now producing 1,300 hours a week by staff that wouldn't normally be resourcing a crew or a vehicle. Prior to the pandemic, that was barely 400 hours a week. So everybody out there is trying to do their bit, but we need to plan for a greater level of abstraction capability, or we will not be able to deliver a lot of the educational developments that we need for our workforce going forwards.
And I guess, Joe, that means that actually our establishment is unsustainable. We can't keep going as we are. Are you confident that we will find ways of getting our training and education and development back on track? I mean, what are the options really for doing that?
I'm confident that we can deliver it if we can find a way of achieving that. And a lot of it is, we aren't going to get more money from the system, so we're not going to get more resource. So we have to look internally at what we've got and how do we rationalise what we've got. How do we utilise the budget that we currently have in order to increase that capability to release staff for that education? And that's where everybody needs to look quite significant or severely at their own at every directorate, and how do we maximise that opportunity, because without that we will always be struggling. So internal efficiency has to be one of the key measures, but with a view to raising that abstraction capability.
I presume David's case for change, as we go beyond the demand and capacity, review establishment figures and look for different ways of doing it, that will be taken care of within that. I mean,
it will, Laurie, but we also need to look at some of those other pressures that are being put upon us. We'll talk later, no doubt, about paramedics in primary care. That becomes a concern for us as well. And we need to consider the operating model that we're running, because the operating model that was favoured by commissioners, the targeted dispatch model, required us to have a high level of paramedics. We don't have them, so that doesn't work. That's probably part of the reason why our Cat 1 mean is as challenged as it is, and that's because the level of response cars, and bearing in mind the way our ARP works, you can get the first person that responds there as ticking that particular ticket, but we have barely a third of the cars out that we might need for the model, because we don't have enough staff to actually resource that.
I think at this point in the meeting, before I bring in Lucy for a question, I think Peter, we note that as a continuing focus of the board's work of this new financial year about to start, and we've clearly got some actions in place, particularly with some work that David Hammonds will be leading. Nevertheless, it is one of our risks, and we have to acknowledge that. The board are acknowledging there's work underway, and we're also acknowledging that we do need to change the way we organise ourselves as well in this area. So we will. That's to be continued, I think, at regular intervals. Lucy.
Hi, Joe.
Hello.
We talked earlier about the welfare van and how meal breaks are really important. I think the other element for staff is obviously the late overruns, to finish work when you say you're going to. Looking back, we've hovered around 50, 60%. We're back down to 50% this month on late overruns. What are we doing about that, and how does that benchmark with other trusts? Because obviously I do understand that the nature of the job, it's very difficult to ensure people finish on time.
The benchmark is more problematic, Lucy. I've done some sort of canvass my Director of Ops peers around the country, and we're all measuring something slightly different. So we measure our shift overruns at anything above 10 minutes over the shift finish time, and that's what generates that figure. And you'll have seen, if you've looked at the data, how that has gone up as we've gone through the high pressure periods, and then it's come back down, but it's still we're at this equilibrium of around 40 odd +%. So when I canvass other trusts, though, they look at it slightly differently. They're measuring perhaps half an hour after their shift finish time. So that will give you a different metric, but is all still predominantly focused at, and I looked at the Westminster data, that was quite interesting. It is the category 1s and 2s that generate those shift overruns predominantly. We have measures in place which we put in to minimise shift overruns for category 3s and 4s. That gives us a bit of an Achilles heel with our ability to deliver performance on category 3 and 4, but it helps to minimise the shift overruns in that respect. But for category 1s and 2s, we will unfortunately still see crews overrun at that point. Which why it's really, really important we go back to, have we been able to give crew an appropriate break in the first instance, so that that they're not running a shift that's 14 hours long without a break, as an example. And the average, I think our average overrun time is recorded at about 40 minutes for those crews as an average. So it's an awful lot, and again it filters back into the level of resourcing necessary. And one thing I hope I haven't misled, Chair, is the fact that when I said having sufficient sufficient staff to do that, we've never been as resourced as we have at the moment from a recruitment perspective. We have really achieved a high level of recruitment. So it's not it's the fact that all of the other abstractions that we require to deliver a modern day ambulance service, and bear in mind 28% was the level I used when I was a lad, so to speak, it requires more, and we need to find a way of resourcing that.
Thank you, Joe. Lucy, anything else?
No, just to say, I think this with meal breaks, the two combined are absolutely key welfare items that I think the board needs to be looking at keenly as we come out of COVID, and particularly, as Joe says, that double whammy of not getting a meal break and getting an overrun, really, really key for our staff and our patients.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Michael, your hand is raised. Is that an old hand or a new question?
No, I've got a question. Well, I've got a comment and a question. Joe, thank you very much. This is really the comment I would make. It seems to me, listening to you when we've listened to you before, we have some systemic issues within our workforce operating model that we need to resolve. David Hammond's review, is it the case for change or whatever we're calling it, is looking to address that going forward. I think we need to recognise that there are risks here, because that is not going to be done, in 6 or even 12 months. So we are really going through a continual period, I think, of turbulence. And I think it's quite important that this group, that looking at the case for change, clearly differentiates between what I would call no regrets decisions, short-term actions that can be taken within 2, 3, 6 months that help relieve some of the pressure, and other longer-term sustainable changes. But you need to recognise that those longer-term sustainable changes will have an implementation gap. So actually modelling that and seeing how you manage that transition is going to be very important, because if we don't, I genuinely believe we'll still be having this conversation in 6 and 9 months' time. So that's just my observation. My question is this. Joe, I think Howard has raised this, and I've raised it before. I still don't really get how we are using or how we are strategically engaging with our private sector providers, because most businesses, and we are a business in a way, we're delivering public service, will be looking for how you utilise other potential deliverers of service. And can you just say a little bit more about that? And I also take the point about extraction, but we have got an ongoing recruitment programme. So over the summer months, what are the number of additional people coming into the organisation? Are we confident that we're prepared to get them as operationally on the road as quickly as possible? So a comment and 2 questions. One about private sector providers. Are we getting the best out of that? Because the figures still seem low. And the second point about the flow of new people coming into the organisation and how well we are prepared to get them operational as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Michael. Do you want to come back with an initial response? Others may wish to contribute.
Yeah, I'll start with the private sector providers if I can. So the way we've used our private sector providers, Michael, is we've effectively used them to fill a gap in the workforce numbers, so that they're part of the overall workforce number. You could argue that we would maybe better off using them as a surge capability, a surge component, but that would mean we would have to structure how we funded those providers in a slightly different way, so that we effectively recruited up to our number, but we had that funding there to provide that level of surge. That's not how we've done it to date, but it is something we could potentially think about in the future if we wanted to cut the cake in a slightly different way. And your second question, which just prompt me again, sorry, Michael.
I'm interested to look at the flow of people coming into the organisation.
So we have been probably our last year was as successful, in particular for newly qualified paramedics, as it ever has been. We've effectively took on the number that we planned to bring on, but within that, when you look at the level of attrition that we've had, we could have potentially tried to take on more. And a recent discussion we've had is how do we effectively oversubscribe our candidates that are coming to us to ensure that the expected attrition that we'll have from some of those candidates is mitigated and we actually get everybody we need. So as an example for that, there's an opportunity we know this year to take on an additional 40 potentially newly qualified paramedics as if you like, an offer at the offer stage, knowing full well that whilst the number we might have in our workforce plan may not be achieved through attrition as we go along, but that's a good way of achieving that. So there's a potential for more if we're prepared to, and it's the debate we've had around the exec table is it's a finely balanced risk, because we could end up in a position where we're having to be oversubscribed with a number of whole-time equivalents at newly qualified paramedic grade. That's a good problem to have, Michael, and I'm sure we can find a way of funding that if we were in that position.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before, are there any other questions, Subu?
So I just had one, just to pick up on your attrition rates that you mentioned, which is really helpful. Do we have any data on the 5-year trends previously in terms of attrition, so that we could plan for that? There is always that danger that you can't then contain them within the system if you then have your subscription. But do we know what the attrition rate has been over the last 5 years that would allow us to do some planning on that?
We do, Subo, and that's what influences our 5-year workforce plan, and that's all captured within the plan. So we know we have a deficit of paramedics for 1st of April onwards, which includes the rate of attrition that we'll see within that for that year, and that's that number is a scary 500.
But clearly we are monitoring that carefully, and
Absolutely,
one of our challenges going forward is to try and retain more of the people we educate and bring through the workforce, isn't it? Thank you.
Yes.
Tom?
Thanks, David, and thanks, Joe. I think David has started to allude to the point I wanted to raise. So, our skill mix and our experience mix across the trust that's a risk for us, isn't it? If we're relying on newly qualified paramedics with little experience, what risks are we considering around that for us compared to having, a lot more experienced people out there interfacing with patients?
It is a risk, Tom, absolutely, but it's probably lesser of a risk than having non-qualified staff on vehicles, and that's been a key concern of ours, to ensure that we monitor the amount of qualified shifts that we put out, and in that respect we're putting out a tiny number of qualified shifts compared to other way around, a huge number of qualified shifts compared to non-qualified. That's probably less than 2%, and we will not take on private sector providers who are providing non-qualified crews either. But the skill mix is a concern, and that 500 figure I gave you refers to the gap in paramedics to the rest of our work. It's not the gap in the workforce, if that makes sense, but it's the skill mix gap that we need to fill.
Thank you. And in relation to that, then, is the arrangements across the trust for clinical supervision?
Yeah,
and how we're embedding that.
Yeah, that clinical supervision is a key part of the progression route for our NQPs to become a qualified paramedic, and they need to undertake a supervisory element to ensure that they're able to supervise junior paramedics from that particular point. So that's a key area of concern. But at the end of the day, we're better off with having as many NQPs as we can to work towards shortening the skill mix gap, because the rate of attrition means that we are looking at a plan. If we exclude any of the elements related to paramedics in primary care, we're looking at a plan that won't deliver until 2026. That's the scale of the problem. And one of the debates we've been having is how can the system give us 500 paramedics this year? Is that even possible?
I can come in that NQP is non-qualified practitioner.
Sorry, yes, I do apologise.
Just to reassure the public, these are people with basic training but don't have the full paramedic.
Yeah, it's a non-qualified paramedic. They've been through their degree education. They are now operating in the field, and they have to do a 2-year qualification period before they become a qualified paramedic. But that doesn't mean they can't operate with a paramedic skill set.
So I thought it was newly qualified paramedic, because they will be registered with the HCPC.
Newly qualified.
Yes.
Thank you. Laurie, do I see your hand raised again?
Yeah, very briefly, Joe. I mean, I understand that in your 5-year workforce plan, you've modelled, if you will, the rate of attrition. Do you have any thoughts about what it's going to be like over the next couple of years? In other words, as the effect of COVID and perhaps a 1% pay rise and all the rest of it, how confident are we that the actual rate of attrition will follow your curve?
I think our attrition rates have been more pessimistic up until now. We saw through first wave of COVID and through the summer much less attrition than we'd anticipated, in particular within our call handling centres. But predominantly that's because everybody else is on furlough, and actually having a job that actually pays you regularly is probably a good thing. And I think that's probably changed society's perception of the value they see in a public sector role and a public sector job. Who knows, Laurie? You know, fortunes change at the turn of a sixpence, don't they? If you're not careful. And if we, I suspect we will see that same desire to hang on to the job for at least the next 12 to 18 months until we emerge from this COVID altered reality that we're in and people get back to trying to think about normal things again.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Just before we move on, Philip moves on to the next item in the performance report. Can I mean, just in summary there, I think it's right we acknowledge as a board in very difficult circumstances how we've managed to sustain a safe service to patients, and with our recent performance as highlighted by Philip, and for that we must be grateful and say thank you. That being said, we're also acknowledging there's some real challenges going forward into the new financial year, which means we will need to do some detailed work as an organisation. We have those plans in place to do that, but nevertheless we just need to acknowledge that, particularly around the sustainability of our workforce and ensuring that we can meet the challenges from our patient demand. So we've clearly got a challenging year ahead, but at least our eyes are open and the board is remaining in control of its destiny. And it's important we do that. And I think just a final comment, I think it's important we communicate this well within the organisation, but also externally. We're clearly not going to fix this overnight. This is a period of transition which we've got to lead the organisation through over a significant period of time, and we do need to make sure that those that take an interest in us, particularly the public, but also those that fund us, understand what we're doing, and we are clearly communicating with them what's going to be a challenging time, but one we have to face up to. So that's a fair summary of the sort of performance challenge. So thank you, Joe, for your report. Philip, where do you want to guide us next in the performance report?
So we should go to David for the finance section.
Thank you. So I'll keep this relatively brief, and obviously happy to take any questions. And I'll take the finance elements of the IPR as read. So just a couple of things to point out from me. We remain on the revised plan for this financial year. To remind the board, we are on a block contract arrangement, as all NHS trusts are, for this year, which is being managed at an ICS level to deliver an ICS control total. So what that means for us is that we have a small deficit as it stands, although conversations are still going on in month 12. So at the moment, to allocate central funding to ICSs and then to providers. So our position as at month 11 is likely to change, but probably to a more positive position than it is there. The small underlying deficit does not represent in any way a worsening of our underlying financial health, but more of the system and the way that the finances are being allocated from the centre due to the COVID pandemic for this year. So we don't have a concern that our financial health is getting worse, but to the chairman's point, obviously we need to run a sustainable organisation going forward and make sure that the total value of resource that we have is allocated to the correct things in the correct way, starting with delivering the best patient care and also welfare to staff, as the board's already picked up on this morning. I think just to finally add a look forward, and obviously we picked this up via the Finance and Investment Committee in much more detail. We have been informed that the block arrangement will be rolled over for the first quarter of the new financial year, starting in April, and we are almost certain, but just waiting for it in writing, that will actually be rolled over for the first half of the year, so for quarters 1 and 2. So that gives us some certainty, but also comes with some inherent risk in that we know that our block calculation was not completely accurate in the way that it was done at the centre. We're not the only organisation in that position. There's several others, and mainly ambulance trusts, interestingly, or a significant number of ambulance trusts. So we're going back to the regional and national teams to continue those conversations. They are aware of the issue, and so hopefully we can resolve that as we roll over the contract in a more balanced way. And we'll keep monitoring it through the Finance and Investment Committee. As I say, it's a very strange year financially, because we are being quite closely managed, but at a regional level as opposed to at a provider level. So it's inherent on us to make sure that we are using good value for we are making good value for money decisions, which I know are managed through the Finance Committee, and I'm sure Michael can talk about that if necessary as well.
Thank you, David. I think the headline is that we have delivered our financial promises, though. That's important for the point of the reputation of the organisation, and as we tackle our wider issues, we have delivered what's expected of us in a very challenging year.
Absolutely, David, and I think as well to point out to the board, and we'll do this, I think, as a wash-up when we've gone past the actual year end. Obviously, we've had a huge number of COVID expenses which have been monitored through the Finance and Investment Committee on behalf of the board, with full business cases and a very positive assurance from the internal auditors on the way that we've managed the finances in that aspect of it, as well as the normal aspects of it. So yeah, it's been
as we're in a pulling meeting, I think that's as important in terms of we give that the board are in control of events. And I thank you for your work on that. So Michael, would you like to introduce the Finance and Investment Committee report? Then we'll take any questions around the financial position. Michael's doing this in lieu of Howard is away today. So and patient safety. So I think, Richard, you're going to lead us into this in Fiona's absence, and then Beth is going to highlight any items by exception. So, Richard.
Great, thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to draw the board's attention to slide 13 of the IPR pack, which is demonstrating that our local medication audits aren't as good as they normally are. This is just a monthly blip down to the fact that we're now reporting on a new software system, our Power BI system, and team leaders are just getting used to uploading their data onto that system. And we've named and shamed a few stations which didn't submit their audits last month, which is unusual, and we'll be chasing up those teams to make sure they get their audits in. Positive news, we agreed at Medicines Governance Group this week that we're going to restart our medicines team unannounced audits of stations. They're going to start immediately, so we'll be back out there now that the COVID restrictions are starting to ease to go out and do independent medicines audits, and I fully expect that the figures will improve in the next IPR. I'd also like to draw the board's attention further down in the IPR to our AQIs, our ambulance quality indicators. We had a really good discussion at Quality and Patient Safety Committee this month about our AQIs and the fact that they're not as good as they could be and should be in our organisation. We're an excellent trust, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't improve on our ambulance quality indicators. For those that aren't aware of what they are, there are basic measurements of how we care for patients with heart attacks, strokes, cardiac arrests, sepsis, and we've got all the capability in the organisation to really excel in this area. So we're going to really focus down on that in the year to come. So positive news to come in future reports. Any questions?
Thank you. Should we take Bethan's report and then we can bring any questions in together then on clinical matters? Bethan? Good morning.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so just a couple of things from me. So firstly, on page 12 of the IPR, there's an exception report around duty of candour. So this measures the amount of time we have, the 10 days that we have to speak to a family or an individual and be open and honest about an incident that has happened that is where a level of harm has been reached. In January, we missed this target by 3 cases, as you'll see from the report. We hit it again in February and are on track to hit it in March, but we did miss by those 3 cases. So we are having a renewed focus on this. There is no specific root cause for that, just that we absolutely need to have a renewed focus. So I won't make any excuses other than to say it's not acceptable. Those patients and their families were ultimately contacted, but it didn't happen for those 3 patients within that 10-day time frame. I'll move on. If I take you to page 23, just a couple of things on these metrics I just want to highlight for you. So firstly, around safeguarding training. So obviously we take mandatory training really seriously, and we have seen a bit of a blip during operational pressures. However, we do have a real focus on this now around statutory and mandatory training. We have restarted that across the whole organisation. We never stopped it for corporate services, but operations, clearly it wasn't possible for all staff to be able to do it then. However, I just want to flag that although it's showing as red, we restart the clock on these, of course, the 1st of April every year. So it will always be 0 on the 1st of April, and we have to, of course, get up to that magical 95% target. So to be at 82% at the end of February, when actually we hadn't been able to do it for a number of months for a large part of the organisation, isn't too bad. So prediction-wise, I'm hoping we'll be close to or meet that 95% target. And clearly we'll report on that at the next board meeting. But I just wanted to flag it. It looks red, but that's because we reset the target and it takes us obviously the year to get back up to compliance. The only other thing I wanted to mention, Chair, was the performance around complaints reporting within the timelines. So this is responding to complaints in a timely way. So in February, you've probably seen that this dipped to 64.5% of complaints being responded to within the required timeframe against a 95% target. And this is purely down to the operational pressures we were facing. So if you can imagine, people managing the complaints and investigating them clearly have to speak with the individuals concerned. And in a lot of cases, the investigating managers have to come from our operations directorate or speak to members of that. And that was not possible when we were in the midst of things in January and February, in the height of REAP 4. I won't repeat REAP, I know Joe's given the explanation around that acronym. So we absolutely did see a dip because investigations took longer due to difficulties with contacting and working with operational staff. That's not a criticism of them, of course it's not. It's just a result of where we were. So we are seeing that eased and we are seeing improved performance, but I just thought it was prudent to explain the rationale for that dip in performance there. And that was all from me. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Bethan. Colleagues, questions of our medical and nursing director about the matters in the quality report before I ask Lucy to summarise the quality committee report? Any items you wish to clarify at all? Richard, can I just ask you mentioned about the ambulance quality indicators, just for the benefit of the public, what work are we going to be doing to improve our performance in there? Is that something we ought to have a cause for concern about, or do you feel we've got the situation under control and trying to move things forward?
For quite some time, Chair, we've been reporting that we're not meeting some of the basic standards in some of these conditions, and it's generally around how we record data rather than patients necessarily coming to any particular harm. So, for example, patients that suffer from a heart attack, our crews, we're certain our crews are asking if these patients are in pain. However, we're not recording what their pain score is in the records, and therefore we're not reaching the required standards when we assess how good our care is. So it's simple things like that with a bit of encouragement and a bit of a push, and putting some new systems and processes in place, we should be able to demonstrate the outstanding care that our crews are delivering in these conditions. So that's the plan, is to really knuckle down on where we can improve in these areas.
Thank you for clarifying. Any questions at all from the board? Lucy, we can move on to, please, the report from the Quality and Patient Safety Committee.
Okay, thank you very much. This report includes two meetings. One is an extraordinary meeting we had in February, and one is our full meeting that we had last week. I will focus on the one that we had last week. The extraordinary meeting is really to do a really focus around COVID and our response to that, but I will touch on that as part of this. These are the areas I wanted to highlight. First of all, the birthing centre transfer rate. So this is something that we had seen as a committee a while ago in the summer, and we'd asked for something to come back to tell us on how progress was. Actually, there'd been an audit done to look at the transfer rates and the C1 requests. And a bit of work had been, quite a lot of work had been done about trying to influence the behaviours about not requesting C1 ambulance cover, but that hasn't worked as planned. So we are going back around to try and come at this in a different way to try and get those C1 requests to be appropriate for the patient. But I thought it was a really good example of how we are continuing. We've got an issue and we are continuing to work that issue to get to the right outcome for our patients. The next one I wanted to highlight was temporary dynamic conveyance. This was a process that we put in place over the Christmas period in response to extreme pressures. And this was just to really highlight to the board that we'd asked for this to just understand the learning. This was the first time that we had undertaken this model. And so we brought this back into committee to understand the learning, should we ever want to use this again and be able to take it forward into other models. I'll touch on the STEMI Care bundle later. Public access defibrillators. This is something that we've escalated to the Executive Management Board. The Trust is responsible for a number of public access defibrillators which need to be rescue ready, which obviously have a lifetime cost in terms of maintaining those. In addition, there are a number of public access defibrillators which are not owned by the Trust, but obviously we would rely on when needed. And so we've asked the Executive Management Board to take all of this under review and to come back with a recommendation about how we ensure ongoing maintenance of these moving forward and the Trust involvement in that. I'll then come into the scrutiny items. So we got an excellent update on the 18th of March and a very detailed update on the 26th of February on our approach to COVID. I think to summarise, I would say that we are being extremely proactive and it's very well managed. And I think our vaccine programme in particular has been extremely impressive in terms of us trying to get our staff vaccinated and going back around, as you can see on the last point, to make sure that if people weren't eligible, we can try and bring them back in when they are. So I think that's been a really proactive and successful programme and will be ongoing. We talked a lot about the 111 CAS clinical model. Philip touched on the electronic prescribing system, which is good. I think the key from there is we're starting to see the value of clinicians in the process. If you look to my second paragraph, that we are, by putting that clinician review into the process, we're ensuring that our patients are ending up with the most clinically appropriate disposition, which is excellent, which means that we're not sending ambulances where we don't need to and not sending people to ED where there is a better clinical path for them. The service has been under extreme pressure though, and if you look in the data in the pack, you can see that nationally we aren't where we would like to be on this, but we are now coming out of this area of sickness and call volumes, and we are now stabilising our clinical model and really hope to see this area coming more into the national levels of performance. The 999 EOC patient safety. We looked at the clinical staffing. We're really pleased to see that clinical safety navigators, which are really provide that oversight of safety in the call centre, are now largely meeting the requirements of having the minimum on call on duty at all times. Although over Christmas welfare callbacks, so for long waits, were not being made because of just the number of calls, we're pleased to see that they are now being made as we would want them to be. There's been a delay in clinical tail audits and no send audits due to some IT changes, but we're expecting to catch those up on the next period. Infection prevention and control, vehicle cleanliness. We looked at this at the request of the last board meeting. And overall, we were assured that we've got the systems and the processes in place. That isn't to say, however, that there aren't issues, in that particularly around where we have vehicle preparation programmes, so they're for non-make ready centre sites, getting to the level of vehicle cleanliness that we would want and deep cleans is challenging. We also recognise that we've had a high number of what we call hot loads, so basically quick turnarounds of ambulance coming off shift and back off shift. However, we were assured that we do have those processes in place and we understand where we are on those areas. I'll come back on stroke. The key point, sorry, on stroke, what I did want to say is we did talk about use of telemedicine to help crews on the ground with stroke patients, and we're seeing that starting to make a really big difference, and the committee was supportive of that moving forward. Really pleased to see at this committee a really good serious incident report. What we've asked is what we would like to see for the standard meetings, which are every 2 months, is all the SIs that have been raised and all the SIs that have been closed in that period. I think that gives a really good overview as a committee of some of the key issues that we're facing as a trust. And what we saw within that are 4 cluster SIs that have been declared, which I think are now going to be called patient safety incidents. They like to change the name of these 3 letter acronyms just to make it even more difficult. But these are ways of reporting themed issues together. And we had a good discussion on those and a number of other SIs, and also how learnings had been brought into the trust. So that was a really good step forward. We looked at medicines management, largely because we would be due to have a Home Office controlled drugs review, which didn't come because of COVID, and we didn't have one last year. So we wanted to understand where we were on medicines management, and we were assured that we are compliant with the Home Office controlled drugs licensing. And although the station audits, as Richard reported earlier, are not where we would ideally want them to be, we're still performing well on those and are expecting those to improve. We received confirmation that the Medicines Management Governance Group is meeting, despite the work pressures that we have been under. We noted there have been no external reviews. Normally we would have police come in, etc., as well to undertake external reviews. So although we don't have that, we are undertaking an internal audit, which will give us some external perspective on this. And we really recognise the improved professional approach towards medicines governance over the years. If I look back to when Joe joined us, it is between chalk and cheese from those days. So Joe, you're leaving this certainly in a much better place than where you found it. Spinal immobilization I'll touch on now, and then Richard's going to come back to this afterwards. So spinal immobilization was something that we discussed in board in July 2020, and we agreed that we were going to adopt some different guidelines around this. And this was on the basis that it would be adopted by JR Calc shortly afterwards, and someone's going to have to help me with that acronym.
Joint Royal College's Ambulance Liaison Committee.
Thank you very much. I could tell you in the round what it meant, but I couldn't actually hit the acronym off the bat. So we were updated by the medical director at the last board meeting, and Richard at our committee, that there'd been made a recommendation that the new guidelines would not be implemented at this time due to some procedural issues relating to a potential conflict of interest related to some members of the guideline development group. So what that meant is we had agreed that this would become our guidance on the basis it would be adopted nationally, and it is not going to be adopted nationally in the short term as we expected. So as a committee, we looked at a number of areas. We got a briefing on how we got to where we got and the governance that surrounded the decision making. We received a review of our own incident reporting since we brought the new guidelines in, and there have been no areas of concern there. We noted that there's been a positive reception from both JR Calc and our staff, and that the guidelines are available to all of our staff in an app that they have available on their iPads. And thirdly, we saw the letters of support from the regional trauma networks about this new guidance that we are now following. So on the basis that we have that support, that it has been rolled out and we can't just roll it back again immediately, and we have seen no incidents, and I think have followed good guidance and governance on this, we would recommend to the board that we do continue with this new guidance, and Richard will pick this up in the subsequent paper. But that was where we landed on QPS. The next number of items are all from the 26th of February and COVID, so I'm not going to go through those. So I'm going to go down to the last section, which is any other matters the committee wishes to escalate to the board. So as Richard said, and I would just underline, looking forward, we had really good discussion about the clinical outcomes that we're achieving, and acknowledged, I think, with the talent and the knowledge that we have in CCAM, that this is an area we really want to focus on in 21-22, and we should and will, I'm confident, do better on. The quality account has been delayed nationally, but we agreed as a committee that we would carry over the 2021 priorities into 21-22, and so that is how we will deal with our quality account this year. We were given an update on duty of candor guidance by our nursing director, Bethan, and confirmation that we were compliant with all these requirements. So to finish the year, QPS has had a busy year. We had 6 scheduled meetings and 13 extraordinary meetings, the 13 being because we've been facing an unprecedented year in terms of making sure that we are keeping our staff and patients safe. And that concludes our QPS report and QPS year. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think it's only appropriate that on behalf of the board, I acknowledge your chairmanship of the Quality Post Safety Committee. I know this is your last meeting as chair of that committee, although you remain on the board for some time yet, for a little while yet. But so thank you for all you've done for championing the cause of patient safety, particularly through our more turbulent years. And for that, we are very grateful indeed. And thank you for all you've done for patients and our staff as well in your work. Colleagues, any questions of Quality Post Safety Committee and of Bethan And Richie, before we move on to the cervical spine
I think
issue.
Subo's got her hand up, Chair.
Sorry, Subo. Subo?
They're not questions, actually, they are comments. First of all, I wanted to say it's really nice to see the complaints and the compliments in the dashboard. Too often we don't see any compliments, we just see all the complaints come through. So that's really nice to see. And I see that we are down from where we started at the beginning of the year. It's gone fluctuated a bit, but we ended up even lower than where we started. So that's really good. And the compliments have gone up. So that's also really good. So well done on that. And the other thing about the vaccination program is that I personally had my vaccine done when I was in HQ, and Steve and Tim jabbed me in the arm with that, and I have to say it was done extremely efficiently and in very good humour, and I had a good explanation of how antibodies are generated, so I can personally say that was extremely well done. So thank you for that, and well done.
Thank you for that. That's appreciated. Thank you. Tom.
Thank you, David. Just a question for Bethan. So obviously the duty of candour issues because of the surges we've been through and things. Just planning for if ever we find ourselves in a similar position, balancing the urgent and the important. So families need to know. They've got a legal right to know when things go wrong. And a legal right for complaints to be responded to in a timely fashion. And I recognise, mercifully, the numbers are small, but these are still individuals and families. So how can we plan to build this in to sustain it if we find ourselves in future surges?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Tom. So what we've done twice now, actually, to cope with this, and it doesn't show in the IPR, is that we have extended the length of time for complaints. So that's an internally determined target. There is no legally required response time for complaints, but clearly we set a 25-day one because that's best practice, and we believe that to be right for patients. But during the first lockdown and then in the most recent difficulties over the Christmas winter period, we took an executive decision to extend that time period. So we've reported correctly here against our internal target of the 25 days, but actually we were working to a longer time. And I think that's how we mitigate the risk. So absolutely we respond to them all, but we just lengthen the number of days that we allow ourselves to take to be realistic. And I think the other thing we do is we do it in a risk-based approach. So clearly you categorise your risks and your levels of harm, and some of them would be SIs as well as complaints, for example, and that you use your expertise and your subject matter expertise to know which ones potentially could take slightly longer to respond to. Does that answer your question? I think that's what we do again, is lengthen that length of time.
Yes, I think so. I think it's just that we're mindful that if we find ourselves in a similar situation, we have a strategy for it. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, if Tom, if it was a matter of us being short of Bethan, the patient experience team, people to write the letters, we would simply use agency staff or something like that. But it's because it's the shortage is the operational folk to do the investigation at the operational end. We can't replace them because you need to have the experience. So I think Bethan's entirely right.
Right. Thank you, Philip. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we can conclude on that item, can we, on quality and patient safety?
Chair,
on to the cervical spine. Yeah. Sorry, Peter.
No. Sorry, I thought you were moving on completely. But
yeah, we'll move on to the issue of the paper on cervical spine and immobilization guideline update. So Richard Shikwerk.
Thanks very much. So Lucy's given a very comprehensive explanation of where we've got to up to this point. Fiona Moore was very keen that the board were able to give a view whether our current position is maintained and to answer any questions if colleagues have any questions on the recent changes. Just to reiterate, the new guidance on not using neck collars, which is essentially what this boils down to, was going to be rolled out to all ambulance trusts. The delay is simply because of a technical issue within NASMED, and that's why it hasn't been rolled out to date. However, the Quality and Patient Safety Committee received extensive assurance from Fiona and also scrutiny from Tom regarding the clinical background to what we've been doing, and are assured that it's safe practice. And indeed, as Lucy's already said, we've had no incidents at all since we implemented the new guidance on not using neck collars for cervical spinal immobilization. So the purpose of bringing it to this part of the board was to answer any further questions that board members may have, but to confirm approval to continue with the process that we've already implemented.
Thank you, Richard. So in effect, we are applying international best practice. What we're doing is appropriately safe, and is we've agreed in connection with our professional partners such as the trauma networks. I think it's another key point in your paper, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, colleagues. Are you happy to accept this? I think it's important as a board we resolve to accept this paper, and we're very clear that we're supporting the actions of our clinicians in adopting this method of working. I think, given that we are pathfinders in this area in terms of the regulations, but we are adopting best practice. Okay, so I'll take silence as assent, and we'll duly minute that. Thank you for your explanation, Richard. Can we move on now to matters of workforce and well-being? So, Ali, you're going to introduce this.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So a few things to add, although I'll keep a couple of the comments fairly brief because they've been covered extensively elsewhere in the briefings that have come up. So I'll explain which ones they are as I go through. So the biggest story we have continues to be absence levels, really, in terms of staff, I think, and the current issue that we're now addressing is how do we welcome back those staff who've been shielding for the last year, who've been clinically extremely vulnerable staff. We know that numbers varied over time. It's not the same number. It's not the same people all the way through the year due to the reasons for absence. But we currently have about 57, 58 staff who are in that group. So the government has announced a pausing of shielding from the 1st of April, and we've set up a group to actually look at that and how we can get those staff back into the jobs which they're employed in recently. It's important, I think, given it's a public meeting, to say that it's not the same as furlough. It's not the same where we've had sort of some 60 staff sitting around at home doing nothing. We've had people engaged and working on alternative duties where we can from home remotely, keeping them safe at the same time. So really important that, so we've got the team set up now, which is getting that process in place. And we are trying to look at all aspects of this, both in terms of physical and mental health, in terms of support for people coming back to the workplace. We've contacted all the staff this morning. Actually, first letters have gone out, and the process will now commence in earnest to get them back. The second point I wanted to cover, which has been covered earlier, so I won't add any more comments to that, which is slide 21 in the pack, which is around continued use of high levels of overtime. But Joe really covered that very fully, so I've got nothing to add to what he said. The third one was on recruitment. We have offered all of the 166 people we're targeting this year to get in terms of NQPs. And again, Joe touched on the fact that we're currently exploring whether or not we can effectively over-recruit to actually deal with known wastage that happened. So last year, for the board's information, at the time we made the offer to the time of people starting, we lost 37 people. And we know that people apply for a number of trusts at the same time, particularly given our geography, that we're bordering on a number of different areas. So people hedge their bets, I think, actually, it's fair to say, actually, in terms of applying for a number of organisations and get job offers from that. A bit like university, really, I think, actually, similar kind of phenomenon. But so we're just looking at that as a team. The fourth one, just to flag, is that the turnover trend has continued to fall throughout the year. Again, I still think this is so it's fallen by about a third through the year. But it's not something that we're resting on our laurels about. Actually, we fully understand that there's no guarantee that will automatically continue. And so the kinds of things we need to put in place around recruiting fully to all of our vacancies, supporting staff, making sure they're looked after at work, all of those things that have been touched on elsewhere, are important to make sure that our turnover rate continues to stay and hopefully improve even further as we go forward. And finally, just to touch on what's in slide 22 in the pack, which is the annual leave carry forward measure that we've put in place, which allows staff to carry forward annual leave remaining for the next couple of years, to be used in the next 2 years for frontline staff and also for corporate staff where it's a COVID-related reason. It's important to say, and I think sort of be able to communicate this, is that earlier in the year our stance very much has been to encourage staff to take their leave because we think it's important for health and well-being that people do that and not store up leave. But you know, we understand it's a complicated picture, and because many people weren't able to travel, and indeed still aren't able to travel. Actually, you know, it's a complicated one when it lands with an individual member of the team. So the provision to take staff to take annual leave forward has been put in place, and that's been agreed locally as well. So those are my key comments, Chair, from the report.
Thank you indeed. Shall we we'll move on to the report from Laurier as Chair of Workforce Committee, then we'll take questions on both presentations. So Laurie, good morning. If you could come in and make your report, please.
Thanks, Chair. I won't paraphrase the paper, but I just wanted to bring out a few key points. The first thing we dealt with was the management response to the AAP issue, that's the Associate Ambulance Practitioner issue, which related to outstanding assignments for about 63 of our colleagues. And I have to say the committee was impressed in the way that the clinical education team had dealt with what could have been a really bad crisis. And they dealt with it very well, both in terms of the impact on the flow of trained staff into service and perhaps more particularly on the way that our 63 colleagues had been involved and had been supported in it. It raises, however, about how the problem emerged in the first place, sort of management failure really, but I guess the wider work on the management of education and training and development should help resolve a repeat of that. Plus, of course, we have the recruitment of a new head of clinical education. I think that's going to make a big difference too. We moved on to HR performance. This used to be called HR transformation, and maybe the difference in terms show how far we've come, because the WWC now takes a regular look at development HR processes and our performance in using them. I say our performance because I think in the past a lot of the HR issues were seen department functions problem, where it's very clear that actually it's about HR and managers working together. And I think what we're beginning to see here is matrix management at its best, with expertise from HR working with line managers to genuinely produce a better result. I have to say that I think the committee are really quite impressed with the way the HR functions are dealing with their performance issues. There's a much stronger grip and perhaps clearer trajectories for how these functions like driving licenses, insurance and all the rest of it are actually being handled. One of the things seeking to do in the way we reported is to identify hotspots, to see if we can find in the way we report on the performance of the trust areas, locations within the trust, where things maybe not be going so well, where there are areas of things like grievance, lack of compliance with the processes, timesheets, all that kind of thing. So we'll get a clearer idea of what's actually happening inside various locations and functions in the trust. We then move on to corporate affairs, which is the term we're now using for this whole conventional comms, social media, internal, external engagement, involvement, and PR messaging. That whole waterfront is captured in the term corporate affairs. And this was a concern originally with QPS, I think in relation to the social media issues a couple of months ago. And I think everyone's been very clear that this is not a criticism of Janine and her team who are doing amazing work, but just that circumstances are changing and the kind of load is changing, and we might need to look more carefully at both the capacity and the capability of the trust in how we handle it. Prepared by Janine and Philip, which Philip presented, showed us the extent of the problem. There are about 10 kind of engagement channels in terms of